Hello, I thought I'd squeeze in chapter 2 before the start of my working day. Chapter 2 is called Mr. Derek Torrance. Becky was obviously the class bully, but David quickly began to realise that the person he should really stay on the right side was in fact his teacher. You see, Mr. Torrance was not a very nice man. Worse than that, Mr. Torrance seemed to take pleasure in embarrassing the children in his care. Whilst bullies like Becky thrived in selecting the most vulnerable or easiest targets, though, Mr. Torrance would target pretty much everybody, working out individual weaknesses and exposing them in the worst possible ways. Take, for example, his treatment of both Trevor and Chris. Now, any teacher with even the slightest bit of respect for their pupils should put a stop to bullying and name-calling the moment they come across it. But not Mr. Torrance. It must have initially seemed like he was simply unaware of what was happening. Maybe he couldn't hear the snide comments coming from the back of the class. Perhaps he was facing the other way when the chair was being kicked. But no, he always knew exactly what was going on, because it wasn't long before he effectively started joining in. Much like the treatment he'd been receiving from Becky, Trevor started receiving similar put-downs from his teacher too. Sometimes, when asking questions to the task, Mr. Torrance would make a nasty remark before Trevor had even managed to put his hand up, his words oozing with sarcasm. And 3 guesses to who will know the answer to this question. Surely not you, Trevor Hargreaves. I'm sure you've been far too busy spending time with friends to have read this term's novel already, he would say with smug satisfaction. At least Becky's insults would only have that little posse of hers as an audience. Mr. Torrance, on the other hand, would bellow his from the front of the class, arms folded, watching and waiting for the pupil's reaction. There was no hiding or escaping from the inevitable shame. It was this public humiliation which also made things difficult for Chris. That stupid nickname had just been a thing that Becky would use, but when Mr. Torrance started using it, he essentially gave everybody else free rein to use it as well. Unlike Becky, Mr. Torrance used the crisp packet name without exception. Every single time he needed Chris's attention, he said it. It began to really get under Chris's skin. It was no big deal when another kid did it. Make a light-hearted remark back, then forget about it. But what could he say back to his teacher? He would look up at his towering frame and see that little expectant glint in his eye. He wanted Chris to react, but Chris knew that if he was stupid enough to do so, there would be some other fate in store, far worse than a little bit of name-calling. David had also been victim of Mr. Torrance's cruelty. Yes, David had confessed to Chris that he used to go to Drumhall School for Boys, but Chris was somebody David instantly knew that he could trust. Plus, it wasn't as if he was ashamed of having attended private school. He just wanted people to know him for who he really was before they started judging him on his background. Anyway, Mr. Torrance, of course, had access to David's school files and knew about where he had come from before they'd even met. And on that first day in English class, Mr. Torrance was prepared and ready. Chris had thrown the crisps back at Becky. David had found his correct seat, and the children were already sat ready for their lesson to begin. Some of you, I'm sure, will have already met David in other classes, began Mr. Torrance, pacing in front of their desks. And I want you all to appreciate how lucky we are to be graced by the presence of somebody from such esteemed lineage. David felt heat prickle up his neck and the morning's breakfast churn heavily in his stomach. All eyes were now on him. Some children with expressions of pity and others, like Becky and her entourage, relishing in the anticipation of what would come next. For David is from wealthy stock, Mr. Torrance continued, and yet he is noble enough to leave his prestigious Drumhall to slum it with us common folk at the state school. At this point, he turned to address David directly. We want you to enjoy your time at our school. So to make you feel more at home here and provide you with some of the comforts you are undoubtedly used to, I made you this. Mr. Torrance gestured for David to stand up. He walked briskly to David's desk, whisked away his chair, and carried it to a cupboard at the back of the room, before picking up something else in its place. David heard the roars of laughter before he could work out what was causing them. Then he saw it. Pulled above his head so that it was almost scraping the ceiling, Mr. Torrance held a mock throne, complete with red velvet padding and a golden outer rim. Nobody seemed to notice or care that his shirt was stretched above his belly button as he carried it. Mr. Torrance had cemented David's fate for weeks of ridicule. For in every single English lesson from that moment on, the throne was awaiting David as he entered the room. The person who arguably got the worst treatment from Mr. Torrance, though, was actually Becky. To some, it might seem right and proper that Becky got a hard time of it too, especially when you considered the hurt and humiliation she routinely caused others. But Mr. Torrance had found Becky's weakness, and he took every available opportunity to expose it, causing more damage to Becky than she would ever be able to inflict on anyone else. Children, I would like you all to open up our new novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Becky, I would like you to begin reading from the first page, began Mr. Torrance during one of David's first lessons. Everybody nervously opened their books, giving them their full attention. Nobody even glanced at Becky, who, crimson-cheeked, sat in a storm of shame, anger, and anxiety. She stared silently at the page for what felt like a good half-minute. "Whenever you're ready, Miss O'Hara," teased Mr. Torrance. "To the Red Crown," Becky slowly began, stumped by the last word. Everybody waited for her to continue. She seemed to plead in distress with the page, her eyes, her brain, for some way to work out what this word was. Mr. Torrance observed the room, ensuring that nobody dared help her. "Country," one of her friends whispered, her hand obscuring the movement of her lips. "Sarah!" snapped Mr. Torrance immediately. "No helping." "Go on, Becky." "To the Red Country," Becky resumed, no less stressed, even with the help of her friend. "And parts of the Grey Crown." Becky was unaware that she was stuck on the same word as before. Mr. Torrance gave a satisfied smirk. "One must wonder, Becky," he interrupted, "what hope there is for you in life when you're unable to read a word that has just been taught to you mere seconds before." The rage bubbled inside Becky, which was exactly what Mr. Torrance wanted. Mr. Torrance would never be on the receiving end of Becky's rage, though. It would instead be Trevor, Chris, David, or the dozens of other children throughout the school that she would routinely target. Becky's anger was fueled every day in English, for she was almost always the first child chosen to read aloud. Not only that, but any time Becky did get round to handing in written work, it would be deeply scrutinised by Mr. Torrance. Spelling mistakes would be shared with the rest of the class, and it would quickly become common knowledge that Becky spelt Russia with an SH in the middle and began the word phone with an F. There we go, that's chapter 2. I think I'll have time as well to quickly rattle through chapter 3 in a separate video. Okay, see you soon. Bye.